Kirsten Jenkins comes from the Science and Technology and Innovation Studies at the University of Edinburgh in United Kingdom. And her work is titled Setting Energy Justice Apart from the Crowd, the Contribution of the Energy and Social Sciences. And well, I see Dr. Kirsten is here. Hi, Kirsten.
Hello, good to see you.
Good to see you. I will just give a quick semblance for those who hear us. First in English. So Dr. Kirsten Jenkins is an early career lecturer in energy, environment, and society within the Science, Technology, and Innovation Studies group in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. Kirsten's background is a sustainable development and human geography scholar with research and teaching interests that center on energy justice, just transition, energy policy, science, technology, and innovation studies, transitions theory, and sustainable energy provisions and use. She is world-renowned for her contribution to the energy social sciences, and I had the pleasure for her to be my PhD supervisor. And now in Spanish, la doctora Kirsten Jenkins es profesora de Energía, Medio Ambiente y Sociedad en el Grupo de Estudios de Ciencia, Tecnología e Innovación de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales y Políticas de la Universidad de Edimburgo. Los antecedentes de Kirsten están centrados en el estudio del desarrollo sostenible y la geografía humana, con intereses de investigación y enseñanza enfocados en la justicia energética, transiciones justas, política energética, estudios de ciencia, tecnología e innovación, teoría de las transiciones y suministro y uso de energía sostenible. Es reconocida mundialmente por su contribución a las ciencias sociales de la energía. Kirsten, it's again a great honor to have you with us today. And without anything else to say, I will leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to say to everyone on the call, it was more of a pleasure to be Adolfo's supervisor and to have him as a PhD student. And it's wonderful to see him in this setting, especially speaking so much Spanish, because I only ever hear him speak English normally. So I have no idea what he just said in my introduction, but I assume it was roughly translated from the English version. I'll say as well, you know, I'm coming at this obviously in English language, but also with a slightly Scottish accent. It doesn't come out very strongly at most moments, but it is there. So if at any point anyone needs me to say anything a bit slower, please just put your hand up and I'll have that as my flag to slow down or translate any words which accidentally slip into Scottish. The third thing I'll say is, unfortunately, we have coronavirus in our household. And although I've tested negative, my partner is positive. So I'm a bit sniffy and a bit tired. But I'm going to try my best to tie together coherent sentences. And I'm very glad to join you remotely in part so that I don't give you coronavirus. Keep your distance from me digitally. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Adolfo, can I check that you can see that?
Yes, we can see that.
Perfect. I was given 45 minutes for this presentation, but ideally I would like to do it a little bit quicker. We'll see how my timing goes. I'll ask Adolfo to write in the chat if I'm going over time. Because I'd love lots of space to have questions from the group and to give some thoughts as well on where this might go for the rest of your conference. Ultimately, it's a presentation of almost two halves. So I want to talk first and foremost about setting energy justice apart from the crowd as one thing, one conceptual separation from everything else that's going on in this area. And in the second part, I want to talk a lot about the contribution of energy social sciences more generally. And in giving this talk, I'm therefore wearing slightly different hats. The first part is coming out of my own PhD research a long time ago now, and also my ongoing work across a variety of projects and a variety of different bits of writing. And then the second leans quite heavily on my involvement with the journal Energy Research and Social Science, which I've been working for I think 5 or 6 years now, and which I hope that you're all familiar with. In writing this presentation, I also started, I think, in a fairly glum frame of mind. As I say, a little bit of illness in the house, a little bit of fatigue, but also just having read in the media over the last few weeks, months and years, how much of a state we're in. A state in terms of climate crisis, a state in terms of geopolitics, a state in terms of trying to make positive progress despite everything that's against us. And I was trying to get myself past this point of pessimism and to think productively again, what can we do about it? Where are the key intervention points where we have opportunities for positive change? And as I have in my research and in my wider life, I always come back to this question of social justice. I think we're seeing amazing things from communities across the world rising up against what they perceive to be injustices. I think we're seeing more and more people use this language in a very productive way to ask questions of how governance and politics are happening. But I still think that we can go further, that we should be thinking about energy transitions and global transitions, of course, as something that's really rapidly needed, but as ones where there are opportunities not just to ask questions of justice, but to attain it in a fundamentally new way. So it's a point of reflection where we're saying there is negativity here, but I think as a group of scholars, particularly in this setting, we should be united as much by the opportunities here as the concerns that we have. And just to say a little bit more about that, for those of you who do want to read an English language book, then this is the one that I'm reading at the moment, which is called The Moth Snowstorm, Nature and Joy. And it's a really fascinating and well-written one that reflects a lot on the nature of the climate crisis. And that, of course, says, as we really know and appreciate these days, that it's as much environmental as it is technological and social. But what this book does, just in the first few chapters very effectively, is clearly lay out how quickly all of this environmental damage and concern has happened, how in the last few generations alone we have created energy systems on global scales that didn't previously exist, that we've created emissions therefore on previous scales that didn't exist before, and also that we've had environmental impacts that in the course of one generation on this planet are really, really noticeable. And they give the example here of, or he does, Michael does, of the decline in biodiversity and insect species in the UK in particular, which even I can see in my few years on the planet are really, really decreasing. But the positive upside from that, of course, is that, yes, we've had this environmental damage in short lifespans, but that we now know that our action has to be quicker, and that there are all of these upswellings in interest, declarations of climate emergency, political priorities, COP meetings, and conferences such as this that try and innovate and tackle this challenge. And within that, of course, it's the nature of my work and everyone else's, that the solutions here aren't just rapid ones, but they're inherently socially just ones. And so my first jumping off point for this presentation is A, to be less depressing, but B, also to say that there is a lot of language here in how we articulate what social justice might look like in this setting. We can use the language of environmental justice, we can use the language of climate justice, and as I'll focus on, we can use the language of energy justice. And in my previous writings, I have been fairly critical of each of those different approaches, and that's what I want to do. I want to take you on a journey here from environmental justice in the first hand to climate and then to energy justice, to see how we can navigate some of this conceptual language, to see how energy justice in particular might be something that we engage with, that we set apart with, and that can be particularly profitable in the mass of everything else. So environmental justice, as I say, is something that I have been critical of and am, to some extent, still critical of. If we look at the origins of it, then it's linked largely in its history to things like the 1970s Dumping on Dixie movement, which was fundamentally concerned with the placement of toxic waste facilities in the US on particular communities that were of lower income, communities that were as ethnic diverse, minorities, and communities who had little political voice to argue back against what was happening. And so it began as a local activism-led and community-led dilemma, and one in which grassroots movement took a particular role in highlighting what was going on, and fundamentally how unfair it was that some parts of the world, of communities, faced more environmental burdens than others. But since that first manifestation back in the 1970s and 80s and feeding into more common literatures as time has gone on, it's also something that we can see grow. It's grown substantively and theoretically. And by this, I mean that it's covering new geographies. It started in the US, but it's transmuted to other places in the world. And it's considering not just the original set of hazards that we are concerned about, those toxic facilities, but other energy systems, household dilemmas, transport emissions, and so on and so forth. And this proliferation, on the one hand, is seen as something that's very positive, because of course there are environmental justices all across the world, but arguably it's something quite limiting as well. This discourse is fundamentally one of exposing injustice, but arguably it hasn't therefore looked at environmental protection or conservation, on the other hand, to say how do we respond to these on a more systematic level and in a more positive level, rather than just solve these smaller scale grassroots and inherently negative situations in which it arises. And arguably this focus limits the impact that it can have and the justice claims that emerge beyond these fairly localized areas, because they are so disparate, because they are so enormous, because we can't see how they interlink and what the tensions and trade-offs might be across them. And therefore, for me, what I'm saying is environmental justice is absolutely part of the picture, but perhaps we need something other in order to get to grips with these claims on a more manageable level. The same is true, I argue, of climate justice. So climate justice emerges later. It has a slightly different background in terms of its evolution and its scope. It first evolved from activism. It looked in a number of different ways at the climate dilemma and those that were affected by it, through things like the sharing of burdens and benefits, who was responsible for climate action, who should be permitted to continue emitting, what mitigation and adaptation might look like, and how fundamentally we reduce CO2 emissions. And we can see a number of ways in which climate justice has had an important role in discussions. It's fundamentally part of our COP meetings, for example. It feeds into some government policy strategy, and there are also really interesting legal cases emerging in a number of different parts of the world. Some in India, some in the US, some in the UK, for example, where particular groups or individuals are suing governments to say that their climate change policies and climate change action are insufficient, particularly for future generations. And so again, there are positives here that we can draw upon, but I still have concerns. Climate change, of course, is on the broadest level an all-enveloping and wicked problem. It is an enormous one that touches everyone on the planet, be it human or non-human. And whilst we do have these little examples of where things have gone well, they are just that. They are fairly limited. They are individuals. They are small communities. They are particularly vocal groups that have managed to find people that are willing to listen. But there isn't yet this massive movement around climate justice that has impacted policy structure in a really, really coherent way. Indeed, climate justice and the way it's formulated is again fairly disparate. There is this claim and this one and that one, and all of it can lead to a very, very complex picture in which the form and the articulation of what is desired is really, really challenging. And that, by logic, means that it can have limited outcomes for particular groups. If you think about it in your own life, for example, although there are climate justice claims happening perhaps in your locale or within your family or within schools that touch upon your lives, I can think of very few ways in which that has percolated to things in policy structures that touch me in other ways. It's not to say it isn't needed again, only that I still ask these questions of, well, is this the right way of going about integrating these justice concerns in the kind of policy action and policy structures and political activism that we actually need? And so arguably, overall, you could say that these are fairly insurmountable, diffuse challenges that fundamentally need to be made more manageable. I really like this image, which sums it up very nicely, to say it could take one person to push at a giant block and to try and encourage action that way, but that is probably not going to be very effective. But if you were to split that up into smaller pieces, if you were to make it more discrete, then each individual could carry part of that burden or carry part of that research exercise or policy structure or political activism structure, and therefore have a smaller but aggregate bigger chance of making change. And this is where I think energy justice for me is something other. I will come back to the idea that energy justice isn't the solution to everything at the end, and there are still lots of unanswered questions here. But it is an area of scholarship that's really rapidly growing, which I know has relevance to your own work and your own concerns, where you are, and globally. And it is set apart in a number of ways, as I'll go on to describe. I put this table up just as a common summary that says effectively energy justice could be a set of definitions. We could say that we want to achieve fair, sustainable and affordable energy for all, but that definition doesn't necessarily work across every context, that justice doesn't translate into every language, and that people fundamentally disagree on what the right outcome might be. So for us, a more productive way of structuring this is to say that energy justice is fundamentally concerned with these tenets. We have distributional justice, recognition justice, and procedural justice as the ones on the left-hand column, and then cosmopolitanism is something that for some authors is also part of this bigger picture. These, I'm aware, might be familiar for a large number of you. So in the next slide, I'll just give a very, very quick summary. I won't dwell on these too much. But it's interesting in and of itself in this table that we say that energy justice here can take on different lenses. We can have an evaluative lens that looks at the current context, that says what are the injustices happening in any situation, who is ignored, who is responsible in the current time and context. Is there a fair process? And then is everyone afforded the same moral rights? Asking that bigger picture question. But it's also something that can critically get us to look forward. It says, how should we solve injustices? Who should we recognize? How do we achieve responsibility, and who do we lean on? And which new processes should be put in place? And this, I think, is really productive. It's exciting and something that fundamentally needs to happen, because every time we articulate to each other that we're going on a low carbon transition, we're already making a set of value judgments. We're already articulating a set of beliefs of what the future should be. And I think this will feed into Laura's presentation too. We're coming up with energy futures and saying normatively, this is what we want to be better by the time that we have gone through this transition, or during this phase of going through an ongoing, never-ending energy transition. And so opening up these questions says not only where have we been, where are we now, but where we might go. And I see, therefore, more of that in the energy justice literature than I do in environmental and climate justice. I said I would unpack these in just a tiny bit of depth, knowing that many of you on the call will probably be familiar with what they are. They're not dissimilar from what we've seen in environmental justice. Indeed, they're a mirror image, but they're applied in a different setting. So we have on our first tenet concerns of distributional justice, which effectively is asking the what question. What is it that we are concerned about? Is it the siting of a nuclear power station? Is it utility scale wind turbine developments, as Adolfo did for his PhD? Or is it resource mining or energy access? And it's questioning for those particular energy technologies or energy system stages, what are the unequal allocations of benefits and ills? Is it that some people have more energy than they can use at an affordable price, and therefore that some don't have any? Is it that that nuclear energy station, power station, provides particular risks for some people and is distant from others who therefore have benefits in comparison? And we can't, in every case, achieve distributional justice. You know, logically, a wind turbine can only go where the wind blows and not in the bottom of a valley. But it's nonetheless important to open up these questions so that even if nothing can be done about it, even if that's fundamentally where the infrastructure works, we can go on the journey of saying, okay, but what happens next? And that's where these other tenets come in. So you have procedural justice as the next one on my list, which says, once you've got past the what, how do we go about doing anything in this area? Excuse me whilst I have a drink. I hope this isn't the beginning of my COVID poisoning. But it asks, how do we go about procedures in this area? How do we create equitable procedures that engage all relevant stakeholders in a way that they're actually listened to and not discriminated against? And this might be things like voting at a national scale, or putting in place different deliberation mechanisms at the community level where everyone has equal space on the platform and where there isn't one person dominating and preventing action. The other one that feeds on then would be recognition, which is asking this question of who. Who is involved in this decision making, and that's a typo, who is given respect in these processes? Again, you can think of particular populations that might be marginalized. A lot of consultation happening when people who work are at work, or when people who have children are looking after their children. A lot of decisions happening on a national level that exclude Indigenous communities by nature of the language that they're written in, or in the forms of documentation that people are forced to interact with, and so on and so forth. And so cumulatively, this is an apparatus to effectively say, let's take stock, let's question what is wrong, what is happening, who it's happening for, and also how we might make it better. And that, to us, is, as I say, more effective than coming up with a single definition of what the world should be. It opens up the opportunity for different articulations that, when structured this way, can have a more well-rounded outlook. Just to reflect a little bit more explicitly, therefore, on how this might be different to environmental justice or climate justice, or indeed other ways of thinking. We say that doing this at the energy level is particularly useful because it helps bound out areas of concern. Effectively, it says we're going to look at this fundamentally in the context of an energy system, but we're also going to look at this as an energy system composed of fundamentally different parts. You have resource mining, you have resource production, if that resource has to be upscaled, you have shipping, you have production, you have shipping again, you have use, and you have waste. And if we were to focus at each stage of those energy systems, which often occur across international networks, and we ask those questions in terms of what, who, and how is being affected at each stage, we can create a map almost of all of the injustices or justice benefits that are occurring. That doesn't mean that we're thinking entirely of the whole globe's environmental problems or climate change problems at a massive scale. It means that we're making things more bounded and that we're drawing discrete lines around each piece. This can mean effectively that you have local investigations of the nature of issues, that you can upscale that to say regionally, what is the impact at a broader level, nationally, what is the impact of a broader level, and then when you connect this whole international system, what is the implication of energy justice for an international whole? I'll give an example of that to make it more tangible. So one of the things that's happening in the UK at the moment is the phase out of petrol and diesel vehicles and the move towards electrification. And on the face of it, that is a policy that looks very productive from a climate change and sustainable development goal perspective. It hits all of the targets in terms of phasing out fossil fuels, cleaning up our cities, and so on and so forth. But what the UK policy doesn't look at is the implications that has up and downstream. Implications at the beginning in terms of where electric vehicle batteries come from and all of the communities that are involved in so-called artisanal mining, which has very negative environmental and human health burdens. And it doesn't look at what happens to all of those petrol and diesel cars that are suddenly going to be out of use, where they go, where the waste streams end up being, and how we transition communities that are really, really wedded to those, that have really expensive cars or tractors or combines or things in agricultural settings that aren't just so easy to phase out because of the nature of them and their cost. And so the argument here would be that, yes, we can look at this in a policy sector in the UK, or indeed for any other country that has similar phase-out ambitions. And that tells us a lot about the nature of justice issues. But then when you connect the other pieces of the system, it reveals a whole new reality, a reality that forces us to think about transitions as a global picture rather than a UK or national one. The other thing we say is, I think in reflection, fairly controversial. And I'd love to hear questions on this one in particular, knowing a little bit about what's going on in your part of the world. But we've said in the past that the fact that energy justice comes primarily as an academic concept, one that has been written by a few scholars in a few traditions in a few different parts of the world, means that it has a clearly defined content and approach. It has this tenets framework, it has this policy ambition, it has this particular articulation. And we think that that's a really useful thing. It means that it can be something practice-oriented, that it can have real-world policy impact because it's a directly translatable framework that can apply in a myriad of different settings. And therefore that we might keep some of this internal coherence, which in environmental and climate justice is a little bit harder to imagine and a little bit harder to describe. Now, that's not to say here that there isn't a role for activism in energy justice outcomes. I think there absolutely is. And this is something that my students remind me of on a weekly basis as they showcase the marches that they're going on, or the lectures that they're listening to, or the activities that are happening in the university union. All of those deliberations have absolutely put pressure on some of the climate discussions that we've been having and on governments. And of course, there are very famous people like Greta Thunberg who have made this an international concern. And so climate activism or energy justice activism absolutely has to be there. But despite that, fundamentally, I think I will always believe personally that it needs to be policy making and industry and some of these big entities and organizations who are fundamentally responsible, who are the most powerful to make change. Again, another example of this. It's a bit ridiculous, but I'll say it. So in Scotland, we have a drink called Iron Brew, which you might have heard of. It's like Coca-Cola, but it's much more Scottish and more delicious. You know, the individual responsibility is on me as a person to drink less of that because it comes in small plastic disposable bottles. And even though I try to do that, you know, that's not where the biggest change is going to happen. If Bar, who create Iron Brew, or if Coca-Cola, who ship this all over the world, suddenly decided that they were going to transition away from plastic bottles to something altogether different, glass, or this unknown recyclable, biodegradable thing that doesn't yet exist, that would have a massive impact on the state of the world and our plastic pollution. And the same is true of energy systems. We're told that we can make a climate impact by turning down the thermostats in our house, which we actually absolutely can, but fundamentally, the biggest polluters are not us. There are huge organizations that are underpinning the way in which we use energy that by changing their operations could make many more emissions reductions and transition realities occur. So again, just reflecting on everything that means there, energy justice arguably does have a framework that can speak to those groups, that it can speak to policy making and industry makers as the most powerful people to make change. And that doesn't mean that everyday people or individuals are entirely not responsible and that activism doesn't play a role, only that my emphasis is on where we can make the most rapid action happen, given how little time we have left in the sense of a climate crisis. And then the third one that I think is useful to reflect upon is the idea that energy justice comes with essentially an arsenal of weapons, for want of a better term, that we do have tangible, measurable methods and policy-oriented models that exist, which can help us think not only what is the state of the problem, but how do we fundamentally grapple with it and research it and translate it into practice. So we have, looking at previous papers that have been published in this area, things like participatory energy budgeting, which allocate resources across different members of society, based on preferences and need. We have electricity equity tariffs, which again distribute the pricing that we might pay based on what we need and what we are able to afford. Policy assessments, which look very critically at the work being done by any national policy maker or internationally policy maker and say it does or it does not meet each of these energy justice goals. And then things like citizens' assemblies, which are, I think, a really, really interesting and novel way of going about energy decision making, which perhaps speak very strongly to notions of participatory justice and justice as recognition. And so in this way, again, where environmental and climate justice might have lots of potential different mechanisms all over the space, we, theoretically speaking, have a narrower lens, a set of ready-made tools which can be applied, but because they're being applied within the context of energy systems and at each of these discrete levels and then on aggregate, allow comparability, allow critical reflection, and allow recommendations to be made that are grounded. And so wrapping up, as I said, this kind of first section of the talk, I don't want to give the impression that energy justice is the perfect thing. Naturally, I've written a lot about it, so I'd like you to believe that, but I'm also very self-aware that there are other options here. But what I will say is from my analysis and my understanding of it, I do think it has a number of different applications that are useful. You can think of it conceptually in terms of how do we imagine what justice might look like, what are we fundamentally concerned with. You have it analytically in terms of evaluating particular contexts, challenges and policies. It then aids decision making, as I say, through some of these methodologies and through some of these metric approaches, perhaps, that allow us to think, what are we prioritizing? Is it justice? Is it procedure? Is it recognition? Is it this technology? Is it that technology? It can aid us thinking about not only technocratic solutions, but ones that are socially acceptable too. As I say, it has this application across the whole energy system, which I think reveals really interesting tensions, trade-offs and dynamics, and which psychologically push us much, much further than the way in which we typically consider energy challenges as something being quite discretely situated on us at any moment in time. It's temporal because it looks partly at, I'm trying to not say the word reinforcing, which is not the right word, ameliorating previous energy justice concerns that have happened, say, in the phase out of fossil fuels historically. It allows us to evaluate what is happening now, and it has this future-looking piece. And of course, in all of this, I believe that it speaks to really responsible actors, not just highlighting who injustice happens for, but who fundamentally is responsible for solving it. Now, I confess that I have absolutely no idea what time it is, and that I have the inability on my screen to see the clock in any regard. But this second piece takes me on my second journey, which is to look beyond energy justice, to say that this is one approach within the energy social sciences, but that there's a broader scholarship here that can contribute in a really, really unique way. And this is where I mentioned that I was changing hat, that I have said everything that I've just said from a research perspective largely, and for someone who's worked in this in a number of years in academic institutions, but that this next piece stems from my work with the Energy Research and Social Science Journal, and some of the work that we're trying to do there to really broaden perspectives on what energy research and social science is, and to make a contribution in a way that's really been lacking. And the contribution, I think, of energy social science cannot be underestimated. This, again, will be familiar to most of you, but there are claims, and I think a lot of evidence, in fact, that energy research of the past has downplayed the role of choice and human dimensions in energy use and environmental change. And I'm drawing on the language of Benjamin Sovacool there, who's paraphrasing a number of other scholars who really believe that in the past, we have had this attitude of technology will save us, and our research has been fairly detached from the users who fundamentally interact with those technologies, who live next to them, who really don't want to live next to them, and so on and so forth. And so we're saying that energy research and social science in combination is fundamentally a question of how we humanize otherwise technocratic energy systems. Part of that is also saying that much of what has been produced historically, and I'm talking, largely decades ago here, has been really technically savvy, technically feasible, perhaps slightly detached from the realities of climate change, but often not quite relevant to what policymakers and business persons consider important. And here again, you can think of particularly technical papers that look at the next advancement of a particular piece of energy infrastructure, but which don't tell us more broadly who might use it, who might not. How might it impact a local area? How might it be received? And what role does it play in an overall energy mix in the context of a gas price security crisis, for example? And so the journal and all of our work is playing into a fundamental interdisciplinary call, essentially, where we're saying we need to broaden the scope of how we look at these issues and these systems. And it'll be well familiar to all of you that this is an enormously burgeoning scholarship. Our journal has only existed for, I think, just over 5 or 6 years now. I should really know that. And in those years, we've seen a massive upswell in the number of submissions we get, over 2,000 a year at the moment, from self-identifying energy social science scholarship. And from people who have fulfilled a niche in terms of the roles that they take on at different institutions. And I'm particularly excited that Laura Watts will be following this talk, because to me, her look on these things, her anthropological lens and her background looking at technologies and telecommunications and futures are so fundamentally part of this social science growth in the nature of the challenges. We have, through this scholarship, begun to reconceptualize energy, as I say, as something that's socio-technical, is socio-material, and it's also political and ethical. It doesn't just get created to sit in a perfect world. It gets created to be taken up by policymakers, to be taken up by communities, to be taken up by individuals, to exist in a space where it can be seen as a positive solution or a negative burden. It is something that is discursively created as much as it is technically created. And of course, therefore, it's something that's incredibly ethical in terms of who and does not have access and who does not, and who does, and vice versa. And so you can think of that in terms of reconceptualizing energy systems more generally, but it's also showing us on a wider level that there are social, political, economic, and technical problems that need a range of social science interventions and solutions. That if technology isn't going to solve it all, we need to have some of this design of policy instruments or decision-making instruments that comes from energy social science scholarship and the social science perspectives in order to intervene in energy systems, to make sure that they're accepted and they're fair, to make sure that they are designed in the right way. And what I'll also say links back to my earlier reflections on bounding out, and says that we can both bound out to energy systems, but we can also consider their ripples. This is coming up a lot in my work at the moment, which is looking at fuel poverty, something I'm working with the Scottish Government on, and saying that fuel poverty is fundamentally an energy concern that has its own particular policy mechanisms and points of intervention around household efficiency, for example, but that it also relates to wider social problems around policy more generally, poverty more generally. It is social marginalization. It is low incomes across all of society. It is people's inability to not to access energy infrastructure because of the way that they rent their homes, or because they've gone into debt in the past and have to use prepayment meters. And so we can use energy as a point where we can still draw a line around it, but we can also see ripples. And through those ripples, we can start to ask bigger questions around not only how do we solve fuel poverty, for example, but how do we have an influence on transport poverty, food poverty, income poverty, social marginalisation and inequity more generally. And again, I think that's exciting because it's giving us an in to ask some of the difficult questions that have to be considered. I can feel myself getting more croaky, so it's quite fortuitous in a way that I just have a few slides left. But what I wanted to do in my kind of closing reflections is to say, okay, I'm very positive about energy justice. I'm very positive about the contributions of energy research and social science. But of course, we don't have all the answers yet. This community, this set of interests has existed under a different name for decades, under an explicit name for a decade, and will continue to exist for decades. So now is a point where we can say, what do we know and what do we not? And I hope that these reflections will fit into your ongoing conversations that you have throughout this conference and throughout the research that you go on to do. And so I've developed kind of 10 points that as an energy social science community, I think that we require more of and that will help steer these onward conversations. We have, as number one, human-centered research methods. We have interviews, we have focus groups, we have citizens' juries, as I mentioned earlier, or community panels, whatever you want to call them. But still, in the grand scheme of things, they represent a fraction of the energy research that goes on. It's still fairly technologically heavy and technologically bounded. And so I think there's room to expand these research methods, to use them to capture lots and lots of different ways of presenting evidence, quantitative, qualitative, from the anthropological perspectives that Laura might bring to something that is perhaps more reductionary. But that we expand that arsenal, essentially recognizing, of course, that individual voices and individual contexts are as fundamental to energy challenge as this bigger picture of technological change. And so I really encourage you to think about what types of methods you are using, how human and to some extent non-human centered they are, and how they might complement other technological pieces. The second one, we claim that there's a lot of interdisciplinary work, and it is there and it's increasing. Laura and I run a master's program together, which is really exciting because it brings in lots of different disciplinary perspectives. But again, in the grand scheme of things, most contributions are still made from a disciplinary silo. And so I think we can really push ourselves here to engage across those different ways of thinking more, to avoid the situation where we become energy social scientists that are the token person on the bid that will say something about people, to have more co-created methods and approaches to research and impact. That means as well that we need more of these collaborative and comparative collaborations, where we're looking not just as one local context, for example, but at similar situations in different countries, so that we can learn from each other. So that we can look at one energy system's uptake in, say, Mexico versus Scotland and say, what was different? What worked well? What didn't? How might Scotland learn from Mexico and vice versa? The third one is that gender and identity awareness, again, is increasing, but still very, very marginalized. And that's in two ways. It's a problem in terms of who is involved in energy systems from a non-academic perspective. So the number of women and people who identify as other involved in oil and gas work, just as one case study, or the number of women that are able to participate in energy decision-making more generally. And it's also the case that even in our research communities, we're still really, really favored towards male participation rather than female participation. That could notionally just be a problem of representation, but more fundamentally, I think, is a problem of different mindsets, thinking in different ways, and what each gender and other genders can bring to the table. Questions of intersectionality being something that Adolfo can also talk to you about. The fourth one, of course, I would be remiss not to put this there, is that energy and justice frameworks and approaches have to be part of this. As I have said so many times and will continue to say, this is a question not just about what is happening now, but the kinds of futures that we are creating. And the language of justice fundamentally needs to be part of that, because it's there implicitly. But the more explicit we can make it, and the more difficult questions we can ask, the more positive the futures will be for a range of stakeholders. The fifth one, I think, is particularly important because it's so often forgotten, that we need discussions of vulnerability and responsibility. I think it's very easy often to reveal injustices, to claim that everything's going wrong for these particular groups, and to kind of hold it there in stasis and say, isn't that bad? But I think it's much, much harder, but much more necessary to say, okay, well, if this is the state of the world, who can fix it? Who do we label as the responsible actor who must take charge of integrating energy justice concerns or justice concerns in climate debates, because they are more practically able to do so? And how do we hold them to account, being the second part of that? The sixth one, communication is central, of course. It's wonderful to be part of an international group communicating now, but we need different forms of communication. Communication that can persuade individuals and firms about the importance of this. And so this is a call for impactful research, or research that's very public facing in terms of what we know and what needs to be done. And also so that we can understand the rhetoric of transitions and these imaginaries of energy futures, so that we can have fundamental conversations around what we're doing, why we're doing it, who's seen in this, who isn't seen in this, and how we compare and contrast different notions of low carbon or net zero. We need these interventions across life cycles and systems. And I think it's particularly important during the research and development phase of technologies, or not that it's more important, but it's particularly interesting. You have models like responsible research and innovation and value-sensitive design, which ask, or normally in the computing and IT world, you know, what are we building into our energy or computing systems in terms of their biases, in terms of their inability, for example, to recognize different facial profiles from different races, as one particularly interesting case study. But we can do that the same way with energy. So we could, for example, look at the smart meters that are being developed and rolled out in the UK at the moment and say, were they designed with second language users in mind? Were they designed with the deaf or blind community in mind? And were they designed with the elderly population in mind? And I think the answer to all of those questions is no. In which case, could we intervene in that research and design process earlier to say, let's change the way in which energy infrastructure is presented and rolled out in order to make it more socially effective and more socially acceptable. The eighth one stems largely from my class at the moment. I have 105 undergraduates who are keeping me on my toes and are saying that we fall into the trap in our teaching as well, that we often talk about policy failures and the limitations of particular schemes, the challenges of thinking about justice, the challenges of trying to work with experts and get them to listen to the research community, and so on and so forth. And they're really pushing me to talk more about policy successes or energy successes more broadly, not just in the policy sense. And I don't think we do that enough. You can very rarely find a paper that says this went really well or this intervention was particularly productive, let's try it somewhere else. And so again, from your research and your conference, I'd encourage you to think about where you can go, what recommendations you can give, and what success might look like as much as what failure might look like. The ninth one is that national cases are, of course, key. I did my own national case studies. Adolfo did his case studies. Laura has done case studies of particular island communities. All of those are really, really rich and useful and tell us a great deal about particular contexts. But we do have to be conscious of how those sit, both in terms of environmental and other international externalities, and also interdependencies with other contexts. Another example would be, at the moment, I'm working on a project looking at the phase out of oil and gas in the North Sea off Scotland's coast. And we're talking a lot about what that might look like, but of course, oil and gas isn't just something produced by us for us, it's part of an international global chain. And so we have to look at the interdependencies in terms of shippings and knock-on implications for other producers in other parts of the world. Or, as I said earlier, what might happen to our petrol and diesel cars if all of a sudden we turned off oil and gas sooner than we planned to phase out oil and gas cars in the context of net zero. And then the 10th one and final one is that a lot of this is positively forward-looking, but we also can't forget the lessons of previous transitions. The phase out of coal in the UK, for example, which happened almost overnight, the phase out of steel in other parts of the world doesn't just have to be energy infrastructure. It can be the overnight closure of particular lines of production, which tell us a great deal about perhaps how not to go about energy transition. Okay, so I'll stop there. Those were my kind of 10 points of intervention, as I say, that I hope that you can carry with you throughout the rest of your conference. And I'm sad that I won't be able to join you for the rest of it, but I please encourage you to engage with all of those challenges. And if you'd like to reach out to me via email, via Twitter, or via ResearchGate. I also put a picture at the bottom, which was the snow that we had here on Saturday. I send best wishes from snowy and beautiful Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, for this great summary of the energy justice scholarship and relevance of energy, of social science in energy, right? And also very timely, even if you say at some point, but incredibly timely. So thank you very much for that. I think that we have many questions from the audience. So just before going to the questions, I just want to remind you that you can ask questions in either English and Spanish. In Arab, we'll be able to assist you with translation, right? So, okay, the first question is by Anna, and she asks, how can the population get involved to pressure other sectors, such as industry, to adopt more sustainable practices?
Yeah, it's a good one. It feeds into what I was saying, that activism fundamentally still has a role here. I see academics partly as people that sit behind desks and do really boring things, but also as activists in our own right, that are asking in our own ways for change to happen. And so, as I say, I've been reflecting more and more on the role of kind of community organization here. I think the mechanisms by which this is happening is changing, and it's changing really interestingly in relation to the use of social media. So social media being used to arrange marches, or being used as a platform for hashtagging particular politicians, or putting up documentaries that, you know, raise new dilemmas in terms of energy crisis and so on and so forth. And so I think those communities have to stay attuned to those mechanisms to communicate that didn't previously exist, to continue to adapt, and to, as you say, pressure not just politicians through those, but industry as well. Lobby industry users to perhaps move to a more clean and green transition than they previously have. We can do that also by mobilizing some of our pressure, by divesting in certain companies, or by changing our tariffs. But I don't think that's going to be as effective as, unfortunately, stomping up and down and going on strike in some regards.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kirsten. Another question here is, the world is moving on towards a renewable energy transition. However, it is not necessary that renewable energy resources will also be sustainable. One of its drawbacks is the end-of-life management of renewable energy systems, which can also generate environmental damage and social conflicts. How can we address this problem?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Again, when we have these low carbon imaginaries, those people who haven't thought about it very critically might say renewables are perfect, renewables are green, renewables will be better. But as you say, there's fundamentally issues associated with those technologies too, in terms of the impacts that they'll have up and downstream. And so one of the ways in which energy justice might be used quite profitably there is to do this kind of whole systems analysis across different technologies, wind, solar, tidal, whatever it is, and to weigh up which of those might have the best outcomes in particular places, which of those tensions and trade-offs exist, which means that wind is better than hydro, you know, in the context of China, for example. And so I'd really encourage that kind of whole systems evaluation, and also really, really explicit discussions as we're having now about problematizing these energy systems, not just assuming, and pushing in terms of national government policy, for example, for exactly the things that I've mentioned, like having phase out of petrol and diesel cars, but also policy surrounding electric vehicle battery development.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kirsten. And maybe also related to that, do you think every country or region should develop their own language of energy justice and embed it in their strategies to tackle energy transitions and climate change, or should there be kind of like universal global language and policy strategies?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not one that I've been asked before, so it's particularly refreshing in that regard. I would think that we would need both, ideally. So if you think of the international organizations and platforms that we have, things like the COP20, whatever meeting we're on next, COP27, cool, then we can use those platforms to have common language within which we discuss issues of energy justice or other notions. And by having that common language above those contexts, we can do some of this comparative work in terms of what's happening well and what is not in certain settings. Beyond that, I think it would have to be devolved to some extent, or it could usefully to be devolved to national levels or local levels as well. So the nature of the challenges facing the north of Scotland in terms of rural communities and electrification, for example, is fundamentally different to what's happening in London. And our language of justice that we use in the West doesn't translate into some languages like they have it in China. Other parts of the world might put more of an animal centric and ecospheric spin on justice and say it's less about humans. So yes, it's partly that international coordination, but also the recognition that it is okay to disagree in different contexts and to face different challenges and to have different cultural backgrounds.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that relates a lot with the previous talk about the living kind of like sustainability from the indigenous territory, from Mayan territory, so local versus global, right? This was very important. And maybe just a couple, because we have a couple more minutes, and last question, what is the role of society in environmental justice, from Miguel?
I'm just going to write it down. Justice. I think environmental justice is born out of society. So when I gave that kind of really, really potted, extremely short background of the origins of environmental justice, as I say, it was largely community-led and activist-led as it protected or articulated the needs of certain communities. And so environmental justice for me wouldn't be there without society in the first place. If we're talking about its ongoing articulation, then it can be more of the same. It can be more highlighting the particular plights of particular communities. It can link to that earlier question of how those communities rise up and ask questions of policy and decision making and highlight particular environmental harms. But I still think that we need to be careful, as I will in every conceptual question, be careful to think about where the major points of intervention might be, whether society is at this present moment in time the most powerful actor that can make the most radical change happen. And if we can't, and if other people agree with me that there are limitations there, then society does have its limitations unless it thinks really strategically about who we push and who we identify as responsible and who we hold accountable.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kirsten. And I want to thank you for your participation in the Congress. It was an amazing talk and in an exercise of procedural justice and transparency. I want to tell you that anything that I told in Spanish was exactly what you heard in English. So
I have no way of proving this. It's just okay.
We'll send the transcript. Thank you very much. And also in representation of the Congress organizers, it's a pleasure to present you with a virtual certificate for your participation as a keynote speaker. And in the following days, the team will make it arrive to you by email. Don't know if you can see this.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And no, thank you. And we hope that you have a lovely rest of the day and that you enjoy snow in Scotland. And take care. Hopefully,